This week in the portion of Balak, we read about Balak commissioning Bilam, who's known as the prophet of the nations, to curse the Jewish people. Just to give the backdrop of what happened, the Jews left Egypt. The Egyptian armies, the civilization was totally decimated and destroyed, and they all went down the Red Sea. Initially, Bilam, who had suggested and advised Paro to institute the bondage, the slavery, he saw it failed. Initially, Bilam, not only was he a prophet, he was also a sorcerer. He had cast a spell around Egypt that no slave would be able to escape from Egypt. So Moshe fled after he killed the Egyptian. They couldn't understand how he was able to break through that force which Bilam put in place. And Bilam had forecasted that Moshe would be the one who will destroy Egypt. When he was a little child, and he was the adopted grandson of Paro, and he was sitting on his lap, he had taken the crown of Paro's son, put it on his own head, and Paro saw this as being very cute. Bilam became infuriated, and he said to Paro, "You must kill that child immediately," because that gesture of taking the crown off your head, putting it on his head, means he will topple Egypt. So he says, "What are you talking about? He's only a young child." He says, "No, this child knows what he's doing." He says, "We'll do a test. Take a plate of gold nuggets and a plate of glowing coals, and we'll see which plate he goes for the coals, the hot coals, or the nuggets." And sure enough, Moshe is going for the gold. Hashem sends Gabriel, the archangel, who pushes his hand away from the gold, and he takes hold of the glowing coal, and he puts the glowing coal to his lips. And this is how Moshe developed the speech impediment. It burnt his lips and the tip of his tongue. This is how this came about. So this child, who originally was forecasted to be the one that destroyed Egypt, sure enough, he kills the Egyptian. The death sentence is pronounced. He's able to flee despite the force which Bilam puts in place. So Bilam knows that this person is lurking out there somewhere, someday maybe coming back to haunt him and to destroy Egypt. And sure enough, 60 years later, Moshe returns as the Redeemer, brings 10 plagues on Egypt. Egypt is decimated. Egypt goes down to the sea. Paro with his armies, and it's the end of Egypt. One civilization who represents evil is removed from the scene. March forward. They come to, after wandering the desert for 40 years, they come to the Trans-Jordan side. And the two giants, Sichon and Og, they're the protectors of Canaan. And as the Midrash tells us, not only were they physically protected because of they were giants, their physicality, but they were the most intense force of evil in existence, even more than Egypt. So to be able to take them down, it wasn't only physical might. This was a battle between good and evil. Moshe was the only one, because he himself represented the spirituality of the total Jewish people. Only he was able to take down these two giants, who were the protectors of Canaan. And miraculously, he killed Sichon, the king of the Amori, and Og, the king of Bashan. He killed both these giants. Now the protectors of Canaan are gone. Canaan is vulnerable to now the Jews. It's wide open. They just march in. What's going to happen? They're going to take over Canaan, and they're going to destroy. And the Canaanites also had a representation of evil. They were also the evil force that had to be removed from existence. And that's why there's a negative commandment of Lo S'chai Kol Neshama. They weren't allowed to leave a survivor. because they have a representation of evil, which is the antithesis of what the Jewish people represent and what God is all about. Balak is frantic. He's frantic. And if you take a look at the verse, it says something interesting. Balak wasn't an ordinary person. Balak himself was very advanced in sorcery, and he was a statesman. He was a king. So he understood things which the common folk did not understand on many levels. So the Torah begins, Balak saw all that Yisrael did to the Amori. The appellation used here is Yisrael. When we speak about the common folk, the masses being terrified from the Jewish people, it says they were terrified from the people. Doesn't say from Yisrael, because they're numerous. Balak saw what Yisrael did to the Amori. You can only remove that giant if you have that spiritual fortitude, an upper hand to remove them, because he is a personification of evil, and only a man like Moshe Rabbeinu could remove him. And Yisrael represents the spiritual profile of the Jewish people. But the common is, what did they understand? They saw we defeated these nations. It must be because of the numbers. It's a numbers game. Balak understood it's not a numbers game. This is fighting toe-to-toe at another realm of battle. Therefore, who does Balak commission? A person also who's a champion in the spiritual realm. And his name is Bilam. Bilam is the prophet of the nations. Except he himself is the representation of evil, and it's going to be a battle between good and evil. Moshe representing good, and Bilam representing evil. And Balak believed that Bilam will succeed because of the evil that he was. Now, it's very interesting. If you understand, at the time of the Ozyasher, it says all the nations of the world, all the kingdoms, the princes, they trembled because of the Jewish people, what happened at the Red Sea. So if that's the case, and there were 250 miracles that took place at the Red Sea, God did for the Jewish people that he never did for anybody else. So if that's the case, what's even the consideration that even if you commission Bilam, the Bilam will succeed in terms of destroying the Jewish people? So the Talmud tells us, based on a verse in Tehillim, in Psalms, that every day there's a moment that God's wrath is expressed. And that moment of wrath, if you know exactly when it is, if you curse anybody, the most intense level of the attribute of justice will come about that person. And when the attribute of justice is in force, you cannot be perfect enough. Bilam knew that exact moment. So Bilam, which was going to curse the Jews at that exact moment, when God wrath is expressed, what do you think happened? So if he would have, and he knew that moment, and he would have cursed us, and he tried to curse us, but yet it didn't happen. But how did it not happen? So Bilam himself openly stated that although God normally gets angry for that moment, that's the wrath of God shows itself in the world, those days that Bilam wanted to curse us, God withheld his wrath even for that moment. So there was never a moment, as they say, Bilam couldn't get a word in edgewise. He could not get in the three letters. He would have said kalei, consuming them, because that's the extent of that period of time. God says, I will not open the door as much as an iota. There will not be a crack. There will not be a crevice. I withhold my anger during those days. And Bilam understood this. So Bilam understood it's futile. It doesn't pay to curse them because it's going to fall on deaf ears, because the attribute of mercy is in place. How did Bilam at the end nearly succeed? He had said that the God of the Jewish people will not tolerate licentiousness, will not tolerate promiscuity. And this is the story of the Baal Peor and the Midianite women. This is what happened. The princess of Midian, Cosbi Basur, openly cohabited with the prince of the tribe of Shimon. And there were other Jews also were involved. There was a plague. 40,000 people died in this plague. Why? Because Bilam says the God of the Jews will not tolerate licentiousness and promiscuity. He knew exactly what he was talking about. As they said, you can skin a cat 9 ways. You can't get through the moment of wrath because Hashem withholds his wrath. You could activate that wrath by causing the Jews to sin in this area of licentiousness. What saved the day? And this is something Bilam did not take into account. Pinchas, Ben Elozar and Aaron HaKohen. Pinchas, the grandson of Aaron, what did he do? He was known as the Zealot. And he avenged the vengeance of God. And he killed Zimri with this Midianite princess in the most vicious way. And that stopped the plague. And God says, if not for Pinchas' zealotry, I would have destroyed the Jewish people. So Bilam was on the right road. It was the right suggestion. But he didn't count on Pinchas intervening and showing his act of zealotry, which nipped it in the bud. But unfortunately, 40,000 Jews perished in that plague. This is what happened. So Bilam was very adept in knowing how exactly to play the game of spiritual versus evil versus good. And he nearly won the game. He knew the playing field. Bilam was the prophet of the nations. What is a prophet? A prophet is a person God communicates with. If you read, based on the Talmud and the Rambam, to be qualified to be a prophet, it's something you have to live your life as an angel, literally, removed from physicality, your mind and your emotion fully invested in God. Only then do you have the capacity to be the vessel to receive the communication. Otherwise, you're not qualified. Bilam was an evil man. Bilam committed bestiality. He lived with his donkey. He was a man who was pompous. He had no relevance to humility. I mean, how does a man like that have the capacity or the worthiness that God should even communicate with him? How? And the Midrash asks the question. And the Midrash says something interesting. The Midrash says, Moshe Rabbeinu speaks about God. Hatzur Tomim Polo. The rock, his actions is perfect. Ki chol drach of mishpat. All his ways of justice. So the Midrash says, Ki lo iniach kodesh baruch hu umos olam pisun pelos lavo. The Jews don't leave an excuse for the nations of the world. At the end of the time, they could come back with God, with something that could bite him, Kaviyachol. God closes every passageway, every breach. What is it? Lomar. What are the nations of the world going to say to God at the end of time? Sha'atori chaktonu. You kept us at arm's length. Lo nasato non san li Yisrael ba'olam. You didn't offer us something which you offered to the Jews. Ma'osak, meaning the Jews we had a prophet. We had Moshe Rabbeinu. God never offered a prophet to the nations of the world. He says, it's not fair. We didn't have a chance. We had no means of communication with you. The Jews had a means of communication. So what did God do? Just as Jews has kings and wise men and prophets, and we were on par. The Jews had kings, we had wise men, we had prophets. Paralleling us, the nations of the world had similar. Hemed Shlomo Melech al Kol Oretz. King Solomon ruled the world supreme. The Babylonian emperor who destroyed the first temple ruled the world supreme. Zebona Beis Hamikdash. Solomon, Shlomo Melech built the first Beis Hamikdash. Vomakama Renonos v'Tachnunim, and he sang many praises and beseechings, supplications of God. V'zech riva. What did Nebuchadnezzar do? He ruled the world supreme. He destroyed the Beis Hamikdash, the temple. V'cher v'gidef. He blasphemed God. He cursed God. V'amar, okay? Nosla davar osher. God gave wealth to David HaMelech. King David had wealth. What did he do with that wealth? Lokach habayis l'shmo. He purchased the building location, the site, for Solomon to build the Beis Hamikdash. Nosel Haman osher. God gave one of a kind of wealth to Haman, who was the viceroy of the Persian Empire. What did he do with that? Lokach umesh shleim el tifcho. He paid the 10,000 talents of silver to have all the Jews slaughtered, to have them annihilated. V'hodula shenotli Yisrael, and all the distinction the Jews had, af motzei shena umas ha'olam. Hemid Moshe Yisrael, the Jews had Moshe being the prophet of the Jewish people. Who would speak God, Moshe would speak to God whenever he chose to. Hemid Lem Bilam. So the nations of the world, the God put the Bilam in that place to give him that level of distinction, relationship. Look at the difference between the Jewish prophets and the non-Jewish prophets. The Jewish prophets, they try to direct the nation of the world, they should not sin. Steer them away from sin. But the prophets which he appointed from the nation of the world, they created a breach that will remove the nations from the world to come. All the Jewish prophets had the attribute of mercy. And he gives examples. But the prophets of nations of the world, they had an exaggerated level of cruelty. Bilam wanted to uproot an innocent people and annihilate them for no reason, other than his inborn hate for God. Parshas Bilam. Therefore, we speak about the portion of Bilam. Lodia, to make known to the world, why did God, after Bilam, not give this ability to nations of the world? Because they will go and misuse it, and they will actually use it as a weapon of destruction rather than enhance and advance mankind. Because this is the representation of that prophecy. Just take a look, read the narrative and see what he tried to bring about. The destruction of the Jewish people to remove gods from the face of the earth. Therefore, God says, after this, nations of the world will no longer have prophecy. Okay? So I asked the question. The nations of the world are going to say, at the end of time, it's not an equal playing field. You gave the Jews Moshe, you gave us Bilam. You didn't give us a prophet. God says, no problem, I'll give you Bilam. Okay? You know, it's like you have a person who has to be a computer genius to be able to understand how to use the computer. And you give somebody else, a person that has a 15 IQ, he can barely put a spoon in his mouth to feed himself. Well, is that an equal playing field? You gave the Jews Moshe, that's why the Jews were who they were. Who did you give us? You gave us Bilam. The man committed bestiality. The man himself was pompous. The man was arrogant. The man was everything but good. But where do you think we're going with this person? Maybe to Atlantic City, to Las Vegas. Where are we going with this guy? Where is he taking us? Take us to the depths of Gehenna. As it says, where is Bilam? He's burning in the depths of spiritual hell. That's where he is. So in what way will this pacify the nations of the world to say, well, you gave us what you gave the Jews? I think it's a phenomenal question. So I think, which I once said, which I think the answer is, at the time the Torah was given at Sinai, what was the state of affairs in the world? What happened at Sinai? God took heaven and brought it onto earth. And heaven was on top of Sinai. The Torah, in its narrative, tells us the mountain billowed smoke and fire. The sound was deafening. The earth was quaking. At a level the world never quaked. The world did not have the capacity to accept God's presence. What do you think happened at that moment? All the nations of the world run to Bilam, and they say, Bilam, the world's coming to an end. What should we do? Bilam says, the world's not coming to an end, not so fast. He says, God made a covenant with us. He will not destroy the world again. So the nations of the world said to Bilam, that's with water. But maybe God now chose to destroy the world with fire. That's why the world is quaking at this level. He says, you bunch of fools. Don't you know what's happening? Hashem oz lamo yitein. Hashem is giving his power to his people, which is the Torah. And they answered, Hashem yivorech zamo v'shalom. God should bless his people with peace, but we're out of here. Now that we're secure, we know the world's not coming to an end. We're going home. Going back to our brothels, to our saunas, to our who knows what, to our idolatry, to our temples of idolatry. We're going back to a regular way of life. Now the question is, at that moment, the nations of the world had a choice. They were informed by the prophet, their prophet, of what the reality was taking place at that moment. What should have they done? When being aware of what was happening, that the Creator descended into existence to give what's most precious and that gives value to existence, which was the basis for existence, that's the objective of existence, and you know that this is the reality, how do you not gravitate and want to embrace that? Once they felt safe, it's not for us, we're out of here. That was the value of Bilam. He may have suffered from megalomania. He may have committed bestiality. He may have been a bad man. But he revealed to you a fact, which you can only know that fact only if you're a prophet. So he utilized his prophetic ability to put you in touch with reality, with truth. Why don't you take advantage of that truth? As a result, at the end of time, when you say, we missed the boat, you can say, you definitely did miss the boat. But you missed the boat, you chose to miss the boat. Because you had enough information which was confirmed to be authentic and true, and you had no interest. You had no interest, you're out of here for good. And you're all going into the oblivion for that reason. And you're all culpable for your behavior. No excuses. It's not because ignorance doesn't legitimize misbehavior. That's not the reason. Of course, you understood and you chose to walk away from it. That's what it's about. So why did God give Bilam to the nations of the world? Not to cause them to sin, to put them in touch with God. They chose to say, it's not our cup of tea. But factually, what happens when God gives this ability to a prophet who's not qualified to be a prophet? He used his ability to try to destroy the Jewish people, to take the world down. He demonstrated the most extreme level of cruelty. Therefore, God says from now on, prophets of the world will not be prophets. It's interesting. We read about Obadiah Novi. Obadiah was a prophet. Obadiah Novi was a convert. Was not Jewish initially. He was an Edomite. And he converted to be a Jew. The Talmud tells us that a convert cannot be a prophet. So if a convert cannot be, and he was a legitimate convert, he became a prophet. So why was Obadiah, why was he the exception to all other Gentiles who converted? He was qualified to be the prophet. Any other convert was not qualified to be a prophet. So the Gemara tells us that Obadiah was a courtier in the court of Achav. Achav was the king of Judah. He had a wife who was worse than a shrew. Her name was Jezebel. They worshipped the Baal, who was a deity. And to the prophets of the Baal and to the prophets of God, he went and gave an order that all prophets of God should be killed, should be murdered, put to death. Obadiah, being a courtier, being aware of this, he took 100 prophets and he hid 50 in one cave, 50 in another cave, and he provided all their provisions. They should be able to survive in hiding. If not for Obadiah's self-sacrifice, prophecy would have come to an end. So why is there prophecy in existence, even among Jews? It's due to Obadiah's self-sacrifice. So although he was a convert, and a convert doesn't qualify to be a prophet, but because of his selfless sacrifice, that there's only prophecy among the Jewish people because of Obadiah, therefore he merited to be the prophet, although he didn't have the pedigree, which normally would allow a person of his background to be a prophet for that reason. But this was even as a prophet, because once God says prophecy has no relevance to non-Jews, even if you convert, but since the pedigree is not a Jewish pedigree, you don't know where it could go. But because it's only due to him that there is this prophecy among Jews, therefore he's deserving of having that level of communication with God for that reason. We find that Avram, the most difficult test of Avram was the Akedah. Here, he's 99 years old. He has no children. He had Yishmael, but he knew Yishmael would not be his spiritual heir. God sends 3 angels, and God himself tells him, even before the angels, that you will have a son. And your name is no longer Abram, it's Avram, and the son you will have, you should name him Yitzchak. He was pre-told at the age of 100, and he will be your successor, and he will be the future of the world. At the age of 100, Yitzchak is born, he's circumcised, Avram is circumcised, his family is circumcised. Fast forward 37 years later, God says to Avram, take the son who you love so much, who was born to you in your old age, bring him up as a burnt offering. Now, this would be, to anyone, the word shocker is an understatement. God doesn't renege on what he says. Here he promises him that this child will be the future, and now he tells him, bring him as a burnt sacrifice, end his life. Avram is so negated to God, he doesn't ask the question. Who am I to ask? There is an answer, but even though I don't know the answer, I could live with that question. Because who am I to ask? That was the test. Torah tells us Avram was, at this time, he was 137 years old. He was a man who had tremendous wealth. He's a man who had tremendous acclaim. He was proclaimed by the world as the Prince of God. It says he rises early in the morning and he hitches his donkey. A man of his age, a man of his prominence, a man of his wealth. Did he have to hitch his own donkey? He had slaves, servants. They could hitch the donkey. Avram hitched his own donkey. Why? So the takeaway is, the Talmud tells us, ha'ava mekalkeles ashura, that a person has all-consuming love, it overrides protocol, and that's why Avram did it himself. Now, Bilam hated and despised the Jews to their core. He wanted to annihilate them. through his curse. And God says to Bilam, I don't want you to curse him, but you can go with him. You will listen, heed my word. The next morning, it says, he rises early in the morning and he hitches his own donkey. We're talking about a man. Avram initially was a humble man. He was the second most humble person who worked the face of the earth. So we could say, he hitches his own donkey. Despite his infirmities, 137, so on and so, you could attribute it to his humility. But Bilam, the man suffers from megalomania. He's a man who's pompous. He's a man who has unquestionable desire for wealth and material. He should hitch his own donkey. So the takeaway is, Hasidim Kalkelis is Ashur. The way he hated, despised the Jews because of what they represented. They are the representative holiness in existence. All that mattered at that moment, the Jews have to be annihilated, have to be cursed to the degree they're cursed out of existence. This is the depth and the breadth of his hate. Now, why did he? And his hate intensified. It went from bad to worse, even worse than that. Initially, he was the advisor who advised Paro to bring about the final solution. What was the final solution? That doesn't mean necessarily physically, but spiritually. Before we left Egypt, at what level were we at? We're at the Mem Teshari Tuma. We're at the 49th level of spiritual purity, that if we would have dropped an iota beneath that point, we would have gone to spiritual oblivion. If we would have, the ecstasy and the triumph of Bilam, that's what he was waiting for. That there should be no vestige of God's presence in this world. The Jewish people represent that. So what happened? Not only did Moshe survive, but the whole Jewish people in their entirety went out of Egypt. And Egypt was left in the dust. They were destroyed. To go to Sinai, which was a world epic event. The whole world was aware of this. The whole world trembled from God, from the Jewish people. They stood in awe. They melted in their presence. How do you think Bilam internalized this and processed this? He was ready to have a meltdown. I mean, here, his dream, the bondage, 210 years, the Jews are going to finally be enslaved and put out of commission, that there should not be, there's not even be a Jewish museum of there was a people in the past, nothing. There should not be a trace of them. And he lost. He lost the fight. These people don't lose the fight until they no longer exist. Now, and they destroy Sichon and Og, which also another representation of evil. Bilam realizes it's coming down to the wire now, that if he doesn't do something which is extreme to destroy the Jewish people, he's lost the battle. Holiness, sanctity will triumph over evil. And therefore, he left no stone unturned. The intensity of his hate even grew in multiples. He hitched his own donkey. He's going to curse the life out of them. And God knew this. But his ability was only if he met that moment of anger, of wrath. God withheld his wrath during this whole period of time. So his curse should fall on deaf ears. Finally, he thought at the end, the story with Balak, that the God of the Jews cannot tolerate, will not tolerate licentiousness. And there was a plague, 40,000 Jews, and it would have gone and consumed us. Pinchas intervened, the zealot, and he silenced that prosecution by showing his zealotry. And Hashem openly attested this fact. I did not consume the Jewish people with my wrath because he avenged my vengeance. That was the story of Pinchas. So Bilam is losing at every level. Even the Balpori lost. He has one. That was his last card. That was the last bullet that he shot. But you know what? He came to that battle believing that the Jews are going to lose the battle against Midian. Because he understood you have to be so spiritually pure to be victorious in that battle. And that battle was a battle of good and evil. It was not a numbers battle. And the Jews didn't have it. So he came to collect his fee at the battle. And he participated in the battle through witchcraft, sorcery, other things. And he was killed. Bilam was finally killed in that battle. The Torah makes it a point. They killed Bilam Bechorev. He was killed with the sword. Why does it make a difference how he was killed? He was killed through cyanide. He was killed through strangulation, through fire. The Torah makes it a point. He was killed by the sword. Now, why was he commissioned to go against Moshe? Because they did their research. Moshe, where did his power lie? His power lied in his mouth. We will get somebody to counter Moshe from the negative side of the equation, Bilam. His power also lies in his mouth. So whose craft did he take? The craft of speech, the blessing, endowment of Hakol Kol Yaakov. Who does that belong to? It belongs to the Jewish people. It does not belong to the non-Jewish people. That craft is al char b'chot tichya. You live by the sword. You're physical people. Power of speech has to do with the spiritual dimension of Jewish people. You have no relevance to it. You stole our craft. As you took our craft to try to destroy us, we will take the craft of the non-Jew, which is the sword, the al char b'tichya, and we'll kill you. And therefore, the Torah makes it a point. How was Bilam's life? How did it come to an end? He was killed with the sword. That's how. Until the Torah told us this story, how Bilam was killed, there's nothing which is superfluous in the Torah. That piece of information was vital. Why is that a vital piece of information? To teach us that you took our craft, we took your craft. And we killed you with the sword. And what's the sword? What's the characteristic nations of the world? Until this moment, nobody knew it. Because what was the blessing that Yitzchak gave to Esau? You shall live by the sword. Esau believed that was a blessing. Well, it came to Sinai, and God offered the Torah to the nations of the world. And the question they asked was, what's it all about? What's written in it? And God says to the Edomites, it says, Lo tirtzach, thou shalt not commit murder. What was the Edomites' response? We can't accept it. It doesn't conform with our lifestyle because we have a blessing from our forefather. We live by the sword. But according to this, Bilam was not an Edomite. So if Bilam was not an Edomite, what does it mean? We took his craft and we killed him with his craft. Because his craft is you live by the sword. You live by the sword, that's the craft of Edom, not Bilam. So the way I understood it was that Esau, when Yitzchak said to him, you will live by the sword, he believed that was an endowment. Factually, it was a classification. He believed he was the spiritual heir of his father. When Yaakov received the brachos and Yitzchak understood he was the heir apparent, and he saw through the deception of Esau, he says, Esau, you know who you are? You're no different than any other Gentile. Your classification as they are. As they live by the sword, you live by the sword. Esau misunderstood. He took it as a blessing, not as a classification. And even up to Sinai, the Edomites believed it was a classification. It was a blessing. When Moshe wanted to go through the Edomite territory, we read a week ago, they said, we'll come against you with the blessing of our forefather. Still the misunderstanding was there. When was this misunderstanding clarified and rectified? You know when? When Bilam was killed by the sword, and the Torah makes it a point, then we know it's not a blessing, but it's a classification. Only now do we know that. If the Torah would have never said those words, we'd say, living by the sword, that's Esau's bracha. That's his endowment. But if that's the case, it has no relevance to Bilam. That the Torah identifies that with Bilam, that tells us it's not a blessing, but rather it's a classification. Could you imagine at Sinai, if Esav would have understood that it's a classification, not a blessing, and he would have embraced the Torah? God says to Esav, it says, Lo tirtzach. They wouldn't have said, we have a blessing from our forefather that we live by the sword. Only then is it a considered reason to reject the Torah. Yitzchak gave him the bracha. Should they minimize that bracha? But if it's not a bracha, it's a classification, it's not justified. How do you not embrace the Torah? The answer was a misunderstanding. And that misunderstanding was so crucial because God understood these people had no relevance to the Torah. It was only offered to them because later they shouldn't come with a complaint. Why did you offer it to us first? I did. You all rejected it. So due to this misunderstanding, they did not embrace it. So therefore, it's only first revealed after the Edomites don't let us through the territory because they say it's that blessing from their forefather. Only then does the Torah reveal through the death of Bilam that achar b'chot ticheh, you live by the sword. It's not something which is unique to the Edomites, but rather it's the classification of all Gentiles that they live by the sword. Stop here this week.